Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 503rd episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, joined by my co-host, Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Mason. I think it's kind of tragic that Spencer is not able to be here today because that means we're not doing video, and no one's going to get to see my sick cowboy hat today.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. We are sorry that Spencer is out as well. He is having a little bit of some rib pain. Had a bit of a big problem there and got over something. Had something bad happen. We hope you're feeling better soon. But we had to have the show go on. And it's Thunder Junction Pick 2 set review day, Abe. So, always improving is a big part of the show. We're going to skip it this week. Just like when you are working out sometimes, Abe, you have a little cheat meal. We're cheating this week. We'll get back to it next week. Didn't land. I thought you might get a Snicker. Didn't hit. That's okay. We move. We vibe.
I never cheat. Not in anything. Not even on my diet.
Okay, Abe. How did you improve this week?
I learned what a cheat meal is.
That's what I thought. All right, we're gonna jump into the Pick 2 set review. This is how we do a set review of the set. A lot of shows do like top 10s or top 8s and that sort of stuff, and that's good. We're actually going to be covering a similar amount of cards. We're going to give you a bit more context when talking about the cards. So often when you listen to one, someone might give a preface or something about like, oh, my 9 through 7 could be interchangeable, and these are kind of more just cards I like. And instead of doing it like that, we just have 4 categories. So we have sleepers, hopefuls, favorites, and hits. We will talk about each of those and what they sort of mean as we get to them. And we're going to start with sleepers. And these are cards that we think are going to probably be pretty big players in one or more formats. And they aren't getting as much love. So we're giving you some of the better cards early on, in our opinion. And Abe, starting off here with your first sleeper, what do you got?
Yeah, so my first sleeper is High Noon. It is a 1 and a white enchantment that says each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, as well as having 4 and a red, sacrifice High Noon, deal 5 damage to any target. This card is, Rule of Law is a 3-mana enchantment that has fringe applications as a sideboard hate card for various combo decks. Also has applications in certain lockout decks or strategies with things like Possibility Storm or whatever. But this just is a full mana knocked off the rate on that card, which occasionally has applications and also has a pretty strong use case for the quote unquote fair usage of a card like this, where let's say you're a deck whose card economy or action economy is much lower than or higher, than your opponents, and you tend to cast a lot more spells in the early game. Like Convoke, for example. You could now play this card in your deck against other decks that are trying to compete by playing to the board with you, but at a slower clip, and, get on board, cast your High Noon, and then your opponent can only do one thing to stay afloat, or keep pace, as well as you being able to continue to hit your land drops and build to the 5 damage, which is a good form of reach, to either push through, a problematic large thing, or, just dealing 5 to your opponent. And doing that at the end of the turn and then untapping and being able to cast the spells that might have accrued in your hand after that is a rebuild is kind of just a good play pattern that you can tap into, which is much easier when you have it at a lower mana cost. So I had not actually seen anyone mention anything about this card, despite it being a strictly better version of a previously obscure but role-playing card. And so I think it's one that's good to keep your eye on as far as going to have applications and a card to keep in your repertoire of problem solvers.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think, like you said, it was a kind of a French-ish card before, but the context matters so much on these things. And this is the set with Plot, which is a mechanic we're going to mention more in the future. But the too long didn't read is Plot. You basically exile a card, and then you can play it again on a future turn without spending mana. So you kind of, pay mana now, and then on any turn in the future, you can cast that card at sorcery speed. So High Noon is actually, contextually and standard lining up incredibly well against any of the Plot cards, right? Abe might have a deck that's trying to set up or kind of maybe 1-2 punch something, and then I play my High Noon along with the kind of deck that I've built that Abe just kind of described, because I think that is going to be the best home for a deck like this. And then suddenly that throws your entire plan off. Even if I play it after you plot, right? You can only play plot spells at sorcery speed, which means only on your turn, and that's going to mean that I can kind of wait as you set up maybe some powerful thing your deck's about, and then just sort of throw your entire game plan off. So I really like High Noon. I think it's great. And I think, I've heard some people compare it negatively compared to like Curse of Silence, which is like a weird comparison to me when it comes to the older formats, because they're like totally different effects, but I understand like white enchantments that slow people down. But I think these white enchantments typically are pretty good, and they are just different effects. And that card draws a card when your opponent plays it if you want to. This card for 5 mana just nugs them. And dealing 5 damage for 5 mana, or 7 total, isn't great, but if it's the last 5 and my High Noon slowed them down a bunch, then that's, very powerful. So I really like this card. I think it is going to be a pretty big player, at least in Standard, if not in more formats like Pioneer.
Yeah, and I think to your point about, plot, it also plays well if your deck has a high amount of plot, or like like when you have your High Noon, you can still spend your mana plotting until you're ready to, right? If you're trying to set up your own whirlwind of things to happen, you can use your High Noon to constrain your opponent's development, right? You plot a bunch of things from your hand while you're doing that, and then maybe play one of those plotted cards without paying mana for it, use your High Noon right on that turn, and then use the rest of them, or, play it on your turn, pop it on the end of their turn, and then continue with the, deploying things. So it plays kind of well on both ends, because plotting doesn't count as casting a spell, and while, I think Curse of Silence, I think also Deafening Silence is one that is hard to beat in terms of rate on an effect like this where it matters. Like it's a Storm hate card or something. Like, and even against like Phoenix in Pioneer, Deafening Silence is a potent one that this is not going to compete with in terms of rate, because that's just the effect for 1 mana where it mattered.
Now, saying this, I wonder if this person meant that card instead of Curse of Silence. Because hearing you talk about it, it's like everything they said makes a lot more sense now that you said that, and it didn't occur to me that they just got the silences confused.
Yeah, it very well could be. My next sleeper is Pillage the Bog, which is black and a green for a sorcery that says, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is twice the number of lands you control. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And it also has plot, which we were just talking about. So you can plot this from your hand for 1 black-green. So you can exile from your hand and then cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost. So this card is just a very, very efficient, like, at its base, it's a sorcery speed impulse on turn 2 in green-black, which is not the best, but not terrible. This scales up incredibly quickly, though. Like, by turn 5, you're looking at the top 10 cards of your library, if you're hitting all your land drops, and then grabbing the card you're looking for out of that, which is either, like, a very powerful, like, can be a combo enabler. It could be, allow you to play a lot more toolboxy, a mid-range deck, being able to play more 1s and 2-ofs that you're digging for when you have access to something like this. You can even plot it, and then if you're, maybe some sort of ramp deck, like Domain, having like its 1 or 2 haymakers, you could plot this and then say, okay, now's the turn where I'm going for it. I need to actually sculpt my hand beyond what I'm doing and find that. And I think just all of the uses of this and just the rate on the ability at sorcery speed. While sorcery is a lot worse than isn't like impulse is much better than this, even probably as at the 3rd land, being able to use your 2 extra mana rather than committing your 2 mana to use this is big. I think that the scaling up on it is pretty easy to imagine. Just being like, oh, look, I drew Pillage the Bog on turn, 7 or 8 in a game of Standard, and now I'm looking at, the top half of my deck almost, to maybe top quarter of my deck, to find the best thing in there for the situation. And that is a really, really powerful thing to do, and to have access to in multiples. You get to see a lot of your deck in colors that don't traditionally get to do so. And that can set up for some really, really strong stuff. I don't know what you think, Mason.
No, I think this card is really good. It is unique because it's kind of like, it needs to be in a type of deck that I don't think really has existed in a while. Like, I don't really want this in like a black-green mid-range deck. Like, maybe I do as like my 60th card post-rotation, right? Like, I lose a lot of strong cards. I need some filler. Because like you said, at its baseline, it is just like an impulse. But, impulses in the mid-game, that's some of the best time, right? Like, you play it then, and you know exactly what you're looking for, and you kind of combo, like 1-2 double spelling. Well, if that's happening in the mid-game with this, I'm looking at like 10 cards You know, like when I first read this card, for some reason I like autocorrected to basic Lance, and I was like, oh, that's still pretty good. And like reading it now, I'm like, oh, this is just Lance. Like I just get to see so much of my deck. And, you know, one thing that I think comes up a lot with cards like this, too, at least traditionally with Impulse and stuff, is sometimes the spot's just right, Abe. And you just cast the card, right? You're just like, listen, I kind of need to use my mana. The next, like, 2 turns are spoken for. Ideally, this is going to find something that's going to speak for that 3rd turn, you know? I just got to use my mana. And obviously, tapping out sorcery speed is a lot worse than a lot of things with plotting this. But if you plot this on, you know, a turn where it's just like, there's not actually much for me to do, I'll set this up. And then, you know, 2 turns later, you kind of ran out of gas. You drew one too many lands. So you play your land for turn, you know, and you look at like the top 12-ish cards of your deck, and you go, all right, what's the best thing I can do from here? It's just an incredible amount of selection. And you know what it really reminds me of, Abe, is actually, I think it's called Team Up. It's like the Alchemy card that's look at the top third of your deck. We're Demonic Tutor for the top third of your deck. And this feels like real Magic version of that. Where if I just play this card in the mid game, you know, if I have 5 lands in play, I probably only have 50 cards in my deck. And so now it's like, yeah, I'm going to look at, you know, a third-ish of my deck, and it only scales up and up. And I really like this card. I think it's going to be used in combo decks, and some used in ramp decks, and some used in Despair Interactive decks. Probably not going to be a 4-of very often unless you're all in trying to do one specific thing. But, you know, even then, it's not unreasonable. And black and green just don't get these kind of effects very often with this many cards. You know, you get Grizzly Salvage, and it has to go to the graveyard. And losing that aspect of things is big, but I do think this card is very nice. My first sleeper, here, is Duelist of the Mind. This is Nathan Stoyer's World Championship card. So this is 1 blue for a star 3 human advisor that has flying and vigilance. Duelist of the Mind's power is equal to the number of cards you've drawn for this turn. So no matter what, it's a 1/3 as long as you start your turn. Whenever you commit a crime, you may draw a card. If you do discard a card, this ability triggers only once each turn. And really quickly, committing a crime is targeting your opponent or really interacting with their stuff. So spell piercing a thing counts, targeting with Mishra Bauble counts, kill spelling a thing counts. Those are all crimes now. So this card is clearly, you know, Ledger Shredder-esque under a different vein, and I think this card is very nice. I especially like it, you know, for formats like Pioneer. There's, you know, maybe some kind of legacy with Brainstorm this card that you really start going, but, you know, this card just seems very good as like an extra version of Ledger Shredder, and maybe even going in decks that were, you know, wanting to play Ledger Shredder type cards, but maybe had a bit more like 1-for-1 interaction and didn't want to double spell quite as much. And I think this card sort of fits into those roles. And I think in Modern it even has a bit of a home because Mishra's Bauble is such a powerful card with this one where, you know, I can play my Duelist of the Mind, play my Bauble, very similar to the Ledger Shredder play pattern, and then just target them on their turn and then commit a crime, get my loot going, so now I can block profitably. And then on my turn, I draw a card for turn. I draw a card from the Bauble and for turn, so now it's attacking for at least a 2/3. So I don't think this card is, like, out of this world insanely powerful, but I think it is very good, and it has a lot of points in smoothing. It's going to make sure your draws come together and enable your graveyard synergies and moving through your deck, and I think it's just been underrated. And Flying Vigilance, you know, with like a pretty reasonably sized like defensive stat line means that it's going to be very easy for it to hit in for like, you know, 2 to 3 points and then just, you know, block your opponent's like mid-level thing and then, you know, just stay around for the next turn. So, Abe, what do you think about this card?
Yeah, I mean, one of the cards I talked about in the last set was Proph's Eidetic Memory, and it's a card that also I know has seen some people kind of toying around with it in Standard in shells of the blue-black mid-range deck as a way to, you know, be a little bit more aggressive and get a little bit more out of some of the looting that a deck like that really needs to have the right pieces at the right time. And this just plays even more into that, to the point where I, you know, could see a world where those cards are kind of existing in harmony, and especially in that kind of shell already. This feels like it slots directly in, as far as, you know, I'm playing some discard spells, some bats and Gixes and stuff, and then also have these other like cantripping elements. This is another way to make sure that I'm hitting the right pieces of my engine and having the right mix through the looting while also applying pressure easily. So it's a lot of things tied into one body, like you said, and it's not hard for me to imagine this card, you know, being part of like on its own, just like a decent clock while playing a little bit of interactive Magic. But even beyond that, being paired with some of the other things going on in Standard to like really be potent. Like this in Rafine, right? That's a lot. Conniving, that's a lot. You know, this could be a 2-drop that allows those blue-black splash, those barely Esper Rafine decks to be, you know, even quicker on the draw and have a little bit more to filter through things than just relying on Rafine. And I think everything you said about being kind of comparable to Ledger Shredder, while it's not as sticky, it does play better in terms of playing with permission than Ledger Shredder does. And I think that's pretty important in a world where counter magic is getting a little bit more important as people are playing. They're casting more and more spells. It's more about the mana exchanges you're able to take advantage of. So it's a little bit more tempo-y than it is a mid-range card, and that, I think, plays well in the current context of things.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had not thought about it with Rafine. It seems very good there. I had thought about it with the Identic Memories, though. That one I had thought of because of you, but did not consider Rafine, and that is probably pretty big, pretty quick.
Card's still legal.
Card's still got another, 4 or 5 months, you know? So it's exciting. Let's see what the challenges have to come up with. But speaking of the challenges, I'm going to see how aggro decks can fight through this next card I have here, which is Dust Animist. It is 1 and a white for a creature spirit 2/3 with flying. If you control 5 or more untapped lands, Dust Animist enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters and a lifelink counter on it and has plot for 1 and a white. So I really like this card. You just can play it against an aggro deck if you're a controlling deck on turn 2. Just a 2/3 flyer is just going to cover most things. Like, things in the air aren't going to be able to bust through it very easily without maybe a Rafine to help them out, you know. Things on the ground are going to even struggle. And then if you're in a spot where you can just plot it because you're, you know, not under a lot of pressure, you don't need to interact early, then it comes down, and this is your Baneslayer-esque card of the set, you know. 4 or 5 flying for just 1 and a white on an earlier turn is very big and leads to a lot of very strong double spell situations where, you know, you can Dust Animus and then do some other way to interact, or Dust Animus, you know, on the turn after you board wipe, they commit, you know, their biggest thing like a Shielded or whatever, and you have this plus counterspell up now in a way that a Baneslayer just could not allow you to do. So this is one of the cards I think does a really good job of using plot. I think the plot cards are all very strong in various ways. Just a lot of the cards in this set and the mechanics are very powerful in ways I think aren't super intuitive. And I think this is just going to be one of the ones that goes slept on. And when people play with it in person, they're going to really feel it.
Yeah, I think this one is just close to being like a hit. I think the thing that might keep it from being a hit is that a lot of the decks, especially in Standard where this is going to see most of its play, have a lot of ways already to interact with creatures that would have an issue with like a Baneslayer Angel. There's a lot of, you know, just like incidental removal that's very good for answering things like this. And that's almost what a Baneslayer needs this day and age, to be like, if I'm going to play a 4/4 or a 4/5 flying lifelinker on turn 5, I need to be able to protect it immediately, almost kind of like a Planeswalker in that regard of like, if this is going to be carrying the game on its back, I can't just rely on it outsizing or outclassing. I need to do a little bit of work to keep it in the game. And this gives you the best chance of that while also just being a good bump in the road along the way. Like if you can't afford to plot it in the early turns or even like the turn before Urath or whatever it is, you know, just playing a 2/3 body that you can block with does pose something that your opponent likely has to spend mana on in those early turns of the game and slow their development that way too. So, yeah, really solid one. I could even see this card in, I mean, some applications, you know, with like Aether Vial, if, you know, format slows down quite significantly. Like I could see that being a thing people do where they're hitting that many land drops. I could also see this being just an efficient spirit to put into your like Pioneer Spirit sideboard for the matchups where you are kind of playing that control game, but also want to like have single like hard hitting threats. Like against Rakdos, for example, like plotting this and then fighting the game over the small ball stuff and then saying, okay, like now here's my thing I'm going to protect. It gives you more muscle than like when you're sitting there protecting Mausoleum Wanderer.
Totally buy that. I also just think, by the way, we haven't talked much about it, but just plotting on turns where your opponent wants to use their mana or the turn before they want to do something like Wrath is very big, you know? with your searching the bog card, if your opponent's holding up like a counter spell or whatever, that's a great reason to plot that card on turn 3, right? Just like, oh, I want to use my mana, but I don't want to walk into your counter spell, right? You're not going to no moralize me or whatever. Like, that is a pretty strong spot. And similar with this, where it's like, yeah, maybe I'm playing it on the turn before you wrath and I have a good amount of pressure, and a deck like that, and just in any format, right? And then the next turn I make my land drop and just present a 4/5 now. That's like a really powerful thing. We often in the past looked for ways to kind of, develop onto the board or present threats or put pressure on them on the turn they're going to wrath, and this is just another way to do it.
Yeah, putting mana on layaway, I think overall is like one of the things that's going to be a bit of a learning curve to play with out of this set, but also be one of the more rewarding things and then like lessons to take away from playing with the set as we get into it, is that like the turns on which you spend the mana versus see the impact of the mana being separated by this mechanic, you're going to get a lot of opportunity to feel like, oh yeah, that actually messed up their play pattern. Like the tempo of, okay, I actually cast these 2 spells because I spent the mana on another turn, but the impact of these spells is hitting at the same time to overload what people are doing. I think that's like something that goes, it's like hard to think about when you are playing a lot of the time until you kind of experience it, or hard to put in practice. But I think that's something that a lot of players are going to learn pretty quick from playing with Blot.
Yeah, I think it's going to happen a lot when it goes against them, right? Because it's sometimes hard to like see what happened to your opponent because you don't see their cards, right? But when it happens to you and your opponent puts you on that disadvantage state, it's just like, oh my god, I can't do anything. It's just like I was getting squeezed, or they're double spelling on a turn where I just literally can't interact. The tools don't exist, and that kind of stuff I think is very powerful. Speaking of powerful, let's move on to our hopeful. These are cards that we hope sort of see play or are something that might have an impact on a format. The power level might vary here. We might be hopeful just because we like this kind of play pattern. Might be hopeful because we think it'd be, a cool card to be in the format, So that's what's going on here. I'll go first here. And my first one is Lost Jitty. So really quick, there are cards in the set with BIG as the set code in the bottom left. They are standard legal. They are in your Thunder Junction packs. They were going to be the epilogue pack, much like Aftermath was last year, but Aftermath was received so poorly that they had to scrap it and just shove it in to Thunder Junction. And so that's why there are some cards you're going to open or see that have the BIG code. They are standard legal. Now we got that out of the way. Lost Jitty is 1 for a legendary artifact equipment. Whenever an equipped creature deals combat damage, put a charge counter on Lost Jitty. It has an equip cost of 1. And then it has 3 abilities. Remove a charge counter from Lost Jitty and then choose one. Untap target land. Target creature can't block this turn. Put a +1/+1 on equipped creature. Sorry, +1/+1 counter, excuse me. So this card has a lot of going on, and it's obviously, I think even the art is just Umezawa's Jitte has, fallen through the Omen path to Thunder Junction. And it was like in the vault that they were breaking into. Spoilers for the story. And, this card is obviously trying to harken back to that while being a more fair version. And there's been a lot of talk about, like, would Jit even be good in current day, modern, and stuff like that. And that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about this card. And I think that people are underappreciating how powerful this card is. I think that the untapped target land mode is the one that is the most appealing to me. And Abe, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. But I think the untapped target land is just going to allow the people to double spell a lot more. And specifically with lands that have abilities, it's going to come up a lot. So Urza Saga is the obvious one because Urza Saga also fetches this card up. But then it gives you a way to, activate your Saga an additional time, right? If you have some extra mana or, multiple counters on your Jitty, you can untap, the Saga plus another land to then remake a construct. That is all very powerful. It also just gives you instant speed ability to untap the mana, right? So now you're kind of representing you have more mana up than you are, even if you don't use it. Sort of a very similar thing we've seen to Jit in the past is that, even if it's not on the thing, it's still minus before, where now we're untapping our land. So interaction is going to be a little bit stronger there. And then honestly, Abe, the thing that I thought the most about with this card that I haven't seen people talk about is just the bounce lands. I think that, for a while now, it's been possible that we should have been playing bounce lands in some decks that weren't just Amulet. We saw Yawgmoth experiment with this with our Boreal Grazer right before the release of the One Ring, And I think just in general, if you're a creature deck that has access to like Urza Saga and maybe a bounce land, Lost City can produce an unreal amount of mana for you. Now the question is trying to figure that stuff out, and figuring out those kind of mana bases in eternal formats can be tough. But I think that's huge, and I think the +1/+1 counter probably worse than +2/+2 on average. But obviously, if your thing gets big, it stays big is huge. And I imagine target creature can't block this turn is pretty much useless unless it's literally winning you the game, and you'll be happy to have it in those spots. And let's be honest, having a removal spell attached to this thing was probably too strong, so removing it for a creature for a single turn is a nice little thing. So Abe, what do you think about Lost City?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said about like untapping lands, I don't know about this bounce land stuff you're talking about, because that seems like a lot of hoops to jump through in order to like gain a mana advantage at a stage in the game where you're like already connecting with a creature. You're already like getting counters on your GT. But I mean, I'm willing to be proved wrong on that. What I really like about this card is that it's a 1-mana equipment with a lot of utility. It's easy to get on the board. It kind of needs some time to snowball. And you don't need to use anything with it as long as you're ahead, which is kind of when it's like the best to have it is when you're behind, right? It'll keep you either caught up or like pushing through. It'll either, right, untapping a land to defend your position if you have like protection spells, or advance your position if you need to just deploy more threats, push through blockers, or like grow your creature. And I think that the put a +1/+1 counter on the Uhud creature, as well as the target creature can't block this turn mode, are like really at their best in a deck like Hardened Scales, which has, at least in my experience playing it, has a problem where beyond like getting your first Ozolith, your Urza Sagas are like not really getting many things that are doing a lot. So far, sometimes you just play like 2 Ozoliths with the intent of like getting the second one when the first one gets prismatic ending or whatever, which is fine. But having another thing that's appealing to get and turns your like expendable or like okay threats into like more value, and also then tapping into some of, like you were saying, the synergy between untapping the land and Urza Saga, or any piece of this really works. So I think that, and that's even more sort of saying anything like proliferating counters on this, doubling counters on this, putting charge counters on this with other things. I think it's the first card that lets you turn charge counters into untapping a land. Dice-Tron enthusiasts beware. But there's just a lot this card can do, and it's at a rate that's really appealing to do it at. And, it's a lot of value to put on your random excess creatures. In the same way that Umezawa's GTA was a lot of value to put on your excess creatures, but in a way that made it so that no one else could use creatures, which was probably, and not probably, which was too much. This card is a more subdued version of that, but still very, very powerful. Like, attacking with this card one time and then making your opponent fear, a Snakeskin Veil or Blossoming Defense or, a God's Willing, whatever it is, that's a really, really strong position to be in with a card that still has way more ways to use the rest of the counters accrued.
I think there's 2 big things to keep in mind. One is to stop thinking about Umezawa's Shite almost, right? Like, I think this card has a real disservice because it is that thing in the lore, so people are drawn to that comparison. But these cards aren't competing outside of Legacy, so don't worry about it. Second, I think the spot where Hardened Scales is a really good spot for it. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like in the heroic-y type stuff you're talking about, like protecting it, but spots like in Jund Saga, where it's like I want to be initiating in combat and beating down, and I want to do things like Thoughtseize plus push you, having the equip cost basically be undone by the hitting one time or attacking with a creature one time and get that mana back, and you don't even have to use it if you don't want to. I just think it's really huge and leads to a lot of like, play this equip, attack, Thoughtseize you, or play this equip, attack, hold up, fatal push your thing, go. Like that is a very real play pattern in my mind. So I don't know. I'm hopeful. I think this card's really cool, and I think equipment just should like actually see more play. Or I wish it saw more play is what I should say. I think so often the equipment we see play just in the game or make it so your opponent can't engage. And that isn't as much fun for me, like Cauldra and the swords and hammers. Like, it's cool, but I wish that there was more like, oh, this feels like an actual weapon and a tool that I use. I think this card really hits there. My next card is Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket. It is black for a legendary creature, skeleton rogue 1/1 with Death Touch. When Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket, deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target non-land permanent from that player's graveyard, and a mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. I just think this card's really cool. It reminds me sort of like kind of a much more fair Ragavan, where it's like, oh, I'm going to get in with this thing. It's going to accrue me some advantage. And I just think it's cool. Like, I like that it works with the other Tiny Bones cards. I like the Tiny Bones is kind of like a, hey, make your opponent discard all the cards and this thing comes up. And I know Waste Not seeing a little bit of play in Pioneer. I don't think this fits in that deck. Maybe it's like a sideboard option for certain matchups where I can like attack into a Phoenix player and take their sleight of hand after they sideboard out impulses, you know. But for the most part, I just think this card's really cool. I really like it. And I think it would be cool to have some sort of black interactive deck with this kind of being the payoff as like, you know, the mainstay of some format or like a role player in a format.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this really uses Death Touch's evasion really well. I'm a big fan of that, where at certain parts of the game, your opponent's not going to care about taking one because they don't have anything worth worrying about being cast in their graveyard. But then at a certain point, like, it doesn't matter what they have in play. They probably can't just let you Tiny Bones them and cast whatever the best thing in their graveyard is. And it's also just a 1-mana legend, which, as we have seen, has a lot of value to be able to play a lot of legends, especially in Standard. There's a lot of cards that synergize with that, and that's, you know, strong in and of itself. And it's a good one drop for a mid-rangey attrition-y kind of game, and, you know, much like Ragavan, but without being so self-enabling. Because there's a lot of times where, let's say you're playing against a more traditional control deck, they're not going to have many non-land permanent cards to cast, so maybe they don't care about this as much. But if you're playing, you know, a Rakdos mid-range mirror, like, you kill their Preacher of the Schism, now you're attacking with Tiny Bones with 3 mana up, like, they probably have to do something about that, or else you're just going to get their Preacher, and that's like a huge swing. So the variation on how good this card is being tied to like kind of what your opponent's deck is doing is also just really cool, in my opinion.
But Abe, what are your 2 picks for this category?
Yeah, so my first card I'm hopeful for is kind of similar to your plot card in terms of it just being a plot card that illustrates the value of like holding on to mana. I think there's one that's going to teach the lesson probably the best. It's Slickshot Showoff, which is 1 of the red for a 1/2 bird wizard with flying and haste that also has whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Slickshot Showoff gets +2/+1 until end turn, and it has plot for 1 in the red. So you might be thinking, why would I ever plot this if it has haste? Right? But the pretty obvious answer is that even though this thing is face up, playing it for free and then having your mana to use to either pump it or protect it when it's a very clearly powerful, you know, double in terms of damage, like double prowess trigger, makes this card, I think, one that's going to showcase the power of choosing the turn on which you're forcing the mana expenditure to happen. Like this thing sitting face up for your opponent, depending, like if your deck is built around making this effect good, it makes your Monastery Swift Spears better. It makes like all of your other prowess creatures much more threatening when they know that they might need to, on a turn, fight over multiple creatures, and they're not sure when that turn's going to be, right? And this is the haymaker of those kinds of effects, is it's getting the most value in terms of damage out of the spells you're casting. And I don't know, I think that having a deck that really does that well would be pretty cool to see and put people to a pretty cool test. I think it's also just another card that, if it brought back the playability of like Lava Dart in Modern, would be kind of cool as well. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I think it's really good, to the point of like, I was thinking like, dang, should I like maybe try and pick some of these up for the SCG I'm playing this weekend in Atlanta and like play Prowess on one of the days, you know? Like, I think Prowess is like not the worst position it's ever been, and this card is really good, and it works with Bobble. It's just so strong with like Manamorphose that I think this card is good, and I am hopeful that it maybe even helps push, you know, Prowess and that kind of stuff in Pioneer in a direction where maybe red is more playable. as like an aggressive base color.
Yeah, it'd be cool to see things that compete with playing Ragavan in your deck that has red creatures in it, like structurally again. Like go back to the age of, okay, well maybe it's worth thinking about Monasteries of Spear and Soulscar Mage and whatever, because those are going to be doing something that Ragavan can't. But we'll see. Ragavan's very good. My other card I am hopeful for is Lava Spur Boots, which is a single mana artifact equipment, which says equipped creature gets +1/+0, haste, and ward 1, and it has a equip cost of 1. So this, much like the Lost GTA, like you were talking about, has the ability to be tutored by Urza Saga, and I think has a lot of applications because of that. I think that, I mean, obviously, you know, I would love to see the return of Hammer Time to its glory, its former glory. I don't think we're there yet. I think this card could be a part of that, but like I've played Swiftfoot Boots before in Hammer, as you know, Mason. And Swiftfoot Boots gives, sure, unconditional hexproof, but it's also 2 mana. You got to tutor up with Stoneforge Mystic or draw it. It's still 1 to equip, and it's not 1 mana. You know, 1 and 2, very different abilities. And honestly, Ward 1 in the games where you're really pinching your opponents goes just as far when you're playing a really condensed game, especially around fast Urza Sagas. And I think in your Urza Saga games, as a Hammer player or as a Scales player or whatever, like the ability to just threaten your large creature coming in with haste immediately, this turns so many of your things into Ginger Brute, and also sits in play and makes it so that for a deck like Hammer, your Pure Steel Paladins now can pick this up and have haste, or, you know, whatever your ancillary creatures are when you're doing your equipping stuff with, like, Forge Anew. The creature you draw off the top of your library is an immediate threat with what you have lying around, and that is so hard for, like, some decks to deal with if they can't clear up the boots themselves, because it puts a lot of pressure on them to constantly have an answer rather than advancing their own game plan. And I mean, I think it's just, haste is really, really strong, and so is Ward 1, especially in games that are about ending them early, or ending them before they get to the point that your opponent wants them to be, and both of those effects on the same card really push towards a game of that being good. And I think even with, like, plot and stuff, this is a card that has other applications outside of just this one, but I think where I'm most hopeful for it is going to be my good old Hammer Time deck.
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, I think in Hammer it's just actually very good. Like everything you just said about Forge Anew in this card is my big thoughts. I think, you know, making a construct, be able to equip it and just attack when you're in those kind of grindier games is big. I think Ward 1 isn't the end of the world, but will come up and will matter, especially with the way Hammer decks play, and, you know, they kind of make things so tight from the start. So I think it's good. I think it's, you know, another addition in alongside Shadow Spear. I keep seeing everyone compare it to Shadow Spear, which is lunacy in my mind. They are different cards that do different things in your deck, and they work together very well. So I like this card a lot. I also think, you know, talked about like Hardened Scales earlier, right? Like this card is very nice as a thing you could potentially grab in your Hardened Scales deck, and, you know, you play something and haste it up, and then suddenly you're presenting a real threat. So I think this card is very good. I think Hammer is the most obvious home for it, but I really am a believer in the Lava Spur Boots, and, you know, this would not surprise me if this was like a hit of the set at the end of the day. But, you know, it is definitely hopeful, I think, for now.
Yeah, I think Ward 1, especially in Hammer, just because I do want to say this, is so good for Hammer because it makes your opponent, like, on those turns where you're kind of posturing, like, this almost acts as Thalia in a way for your opponent, because when they're posturing to try to make sure they can answer something, should you present, right, like, okay, well, here's my, like, I'm in on this creature now. You know, for them to be representing, okay, I have Solitude, they now need to hold up an additional mana. For them to be like, okay, I have, you know, whatever their removal spell is, Unholy Heat, you know, or whatever, they need to present 2 mana instead of 1, and that slowly, as we see with cards like Thalia, chips away at your opponent's development in a way that opens up new windows because you've had more time because of things like that. So I am really, really hopeful for this card. You know, I'm not ready to say I'm sleeving up my hammers again, but I am ready to say that I want to. So
that is fair and valid. I honestly, too, I think, like, you know, when you equip this too, right, it really kind of, like, if they're on like 2 mana or whatever, it kind of like maybe clears the way for you, right? Like if before I even hammer something up, if I go, equip Lava Spur boots, they're kind of forced to interact. If I have something like, a Giver that really makes it tough, or like a Surge of Salvation, and it can kind of just be like, okay, if I get the boots on there, I have them checkmated, and if not, I can sort of, like, I haven't thought they've had a second kill spell, so I'm just gonna kind of shove and see, and make the odds better for me. And I like this card a lot. I think it really plays very, very well with the deck. So.
Yeah. So just talking about my favorite deck, going on my favorite cards of the set. See what I did there, Mason?
I love it.
My first favorite of the set is one of the Spree cards, Return the Favor. So the Spree mechanic is a new one. It's a new templating of a card where it has a base cost, and you can't cast it without paying one or more of the additional costs on the card. So this one is red, and has two different Spree costs. One is an additional... They're actually both an additional generic mana for this one. The first one is copy target instant spell, sorcery spell, activate ability, or triggered ability. And you may choose new targets for the copy. So that would be red, 1 to do that. Or you can pay red, 1 to change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. That's the other mode on it. Or you could pay both of those Spree costs, so a total of red, and 2, to do both things. And you may not know this about me, Mason, but one of my favorite cards is Wild Ricochet. Like, growing up and playing Magic, I loved to Wild Ricochet a spell. Like, we'd play these, like, big multiplayer casual games, and someone would cast a Cruel Ultimatum, and I would just be able to, like, Wild Ricochet it, cast my own Cruel Ultimatum, and make them Cruel Ultimatum someone else instead of me. And that was, like, peak Magic. And this card is just a better version of that card that was so sweet to cast. And I hope that this is as sweet to cast in any situation as I want it to feel back when I would do that in quote unquote the good old days, because I don't know, it's a really sick and powerful effect when it really lands, and having the use case of, okay, maybe I'm just like changing the target of your removal spell to your creature in a game of limited, or like I'm copying your Haymaker draw spell, or threat or whatever, or doing both, are just so sweet. It's a card that is only ever a sick story in my mind. And so that's definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah, this card's super sweet. I don't have much to add. I love it as well, and I love the name, so I'm all about it.
Have you ever cast a Wild Ricochet, Mason?
I don't think so, to be honest.
You should get on that. Think of a spell you'd like to Wild Ricochet, and then let me know how it feels in your mind after the show. I
want to do that to your Return the Favor.
Why are you like this?
And if I
my other favorite is another Spree card, and this one I think is probably just a good card too. So it's single white as the base cost, and it has 3 different Spree modes. So you can either tag on a single mana to make it have all creatures lose all abilities until end of turn, or for single mana, have it choose a creature you control, it gains indestructible until end of turn. And also the last mode, which is probably the most important, 3 white as an additional cost to destroy all creatures. So this ranges from 3 white instant speed Wrath of God on its own to if you're getting into 7 mana, you can choose a creature you control to keep around after that Wrath, or at 7 mana you can make it so that all of your opponent's stuff loses any dying triggers, anything that's gonna affect. All of that goes away for the effect of that instant speed Wrath, or both. Like, you can keep your best creature around and completely wipe the board with no consequences, and that is just like, I don't know, it's sweet to do, and I like having a card that plays in a range from like, this can be my combat trick, or like my way to like shut off a like strong synergy of creatures on my opponent's side of the board, and just like dress downing them a bit, ranging from that to we're hitting the reset button right now for a bunch of mana. And I think that especially like you were talking about with your hopeful, like, this is a card you could play as 1 or 2 of that you want to use to wrath the board at instant speed in your control deck, with your plot card, you're going to have 5 untapped lands, and now also it's doing that and protecting the threats that you're plotting and deploying later in the game too. So I really like that versatility of just thinking about the way it plays with each of the modes together, especially the 2 modes that you think of as being, complements to the Wrath mode, but taking the Wrath mode out of the picture too. Like, the times where you get to do that, it kind of has the Valorous stance effect of like, yeah, I'm playing this to kill their big thing, but sometimes I'll protect my thing that matters to me a lot, and that will be really, really sweet too.
Yep, game designers love Valorous stance, and this definitely is a Valorous stance card. And I think that, like, the buyout clause of, oh yeah, lose all abilities comes up a good amount, just like if my opponent has, some card that's like causing problems, having all creatures lose all abilities means that that might give me some way to like not die to it, and much rather Wrath, but maybe I don't have the time to Wrath, right? Maybe this is turn 4 or whatever. I just need to stabilize. So I really like this card. I think it is great, and it's a cool one. It's a cool favorite. Great,
yeah,
great name
not
too.
quite dress down, but I mean, if you're stopping their Primeval Titan from attacking you or whatever, you're stopping their stopping whatever creature doing whatever thing is happening to you from happening, you're going to feel good about having this card.
I would say calling a card dress down is a pejorative. So I think that's a good way to compliment this card. My first favorite is Claim Jumper. It's 2 and a white for a Rabbit Mercenary, 3/3 with Vigilance. When Claim Jumper enters the battlefield, your opponent controls more lands than you. You may search your library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then if they still control more lands, so you repeat this once more, then shuffle your deck. I think this is just a cool card to, like, if your opponent's ramping, this is, like, I'm not exactly sure why you would want to do this instead, but, like, you could play this as a way to catch up with them. Like, maybe this is, like, a weird card that, like, turns out the body's well enough statted, and there's, like, a ramp mirror that's, like, white-based or whatever, and then you can play this as a way to catch up on the draw. I just really like this card. I think that's really cool that it, like, basically says, like, hey, catch up to your opponent. And if you've been missing land drops and you're, like, mana screwed or whatever, Claim Jumper, like, helps you catch up to them. So I really like this card. I think it is super neat.
Yeah, I don't know that it's something I seeing a lot of play in many construct formats, but it's definitely one that just, like, makes games better when it happens, and otherwise is, like, fine. And I think that's a really, really good card to have around, and a solid one to, like, for many, many applications, just a good one to have access to.
Next up is Phantom Interference. This is also a spree card, so its first cost is always going to be blue, and it's an instant. And the first spree mode is for 3 generic mana. You can create a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. And the other mode is for 1 generic mana. You can counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. So we've seen these sort of Make Disappear has been the best one of these. Right? Let's just get that out of the way. And it's probably better than this card a lot of the time. But we won't have Make Disappear forever. It's going to leave. And this card is a really powerful card because, you're going to need to play counter target spell unless you pay 2 some percentage of the time, or if you're playing like a tempo deck. And yes, No More Lies exists. And that card requires you to be in the Azorius colors. You need to be blue and white. So this one lets you be playing a card like this outside of that if you're just a blue X deck. And I like this sort of effect in general. Typically, they're not the strongest in the world, and that's why they've always need something else attached to them compared to a 3-mana version. But this version has the buyout clause of giving you a 2/2 for 4 mana with flying, which isn't the greatest. But, if the early game, Abe's playing off curve because he doesn't want me to get him with this card, and then I just end up, developing a 2/2 and start applying a bit more pressure, that could be huge. And, heaven forbid I get the combo of using both modes together, and I make a 2/2 and counter your spell. That's going to be very powerful. So I really like this card. I'm really excited to see sort of what this does once Make Disappear leaves the format. And maybe even before then, maybe it's reasonable to play one of these in like your controlling deck, because now, your control deck wasn't very good at using Make Disappear's other mode, but now making a 2/2 is like a pretty real-ish thing to do if the game goes forever. You need some way to win.
Yeah, I mean, anything that looks like Mystic Snake, I'm already a fan of. Notably, also, I gotta give shout out to my time throwing down leagues, Pioneer Luchy. There's a lot of Micromancer packages, and this would be another one that slots in real well there. But anytime you're casting this for the full cost and getting a spell, it's absurd. And the flat rate of just 2 mana counter unless they pay 2, I think has only gotten better recently. Like I was saying, as games have gotten more about tighter game mana expenditure rather than bigger game, like, resource planning. In a lot of cases, like counter unless pay 2 is really serviceable and it plays really well with a lot of things. And the other mode of, okay, you're clearly playing around my soft counterspell, let me just make a 2/2 and start attacking you and at least get something out of that rather than have the dead card sit around is great.
Time for the hits. These are the cards that we think are going to be big format players, sort of, on a normal top 10 list, the number 1s and 2s-ish of those. And I'll go first here with another blue spree card, and that's 3 steps ahead. This is blue for an instant. Its first spree mode is for an additional 1 in the blue. You can counter target spell, so it turns into a cancel. For additional 3 mana, you can create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control. And then for additional 2 mana, you can draw 2 cards and discard a card. So this card, for 5 mana is counter target spell, draw 2, discard a card. That's pretty fine or whatever. But, at the end of the day, Abe, really just control decks and standard end up playing a cancel. They don't really like it. They often end up playing 1 or 2. This is a great one of those, and great for formats like Pioneer where you do kind of wish to have 1 cancel, maybe even 2, because there are times you need to answer big things and your soft permission won't be enough. So having this be that card that can do that, but also, you can turn it into a draw 2, discard a card, so that is a great buyout clause. And then also, this card does a good job of enabling other types of decks and then giving them a counter spell, so let's say I'm trying to play some Reanimator deck or set up a graveyard deck. Draw 2, discard 1 for 3 mana isn't the greatest, but if I'm getting a big creature into play or a big artifact, I might want to copy that, right? So the other copy mode comes in handy pretty well there. And then I have this as a counterspell for once I've gotten my big 3 in play to protect it. So it's obviously a card that sees its best in a controlling shell. And also for its worth, to make a token of a copy creature or artifact, control decks typically need a creature to win these days, and being able to copy something like your Lockthorn Whale or, Dust Animist we talked about earlier, and just have another 4 or 5 flying lifelink out of nowhere is pretty big, and this is all at instant speed. So I like this card a lot. I think it is very versatile and very strong. And it's definitely, like you mentioned with your other card being a Valorous stance, Final Showdown, this one is definitely a Valorous stance card.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about, I just mentioned Micromancer. You're trying to 3 steps ahead, counter their spell, copy your Micromancer, get another 3 steps ahead. It's the lock. It's basically Splinter Twin.
Luchy copying my 3 steps ahead, which will then
copy my Luchy, which will then
win the game.
Copy my 3 steps ahead.
But
then trigger with a Blood Artist, we're going infinite. That is actually Splinter Twin.
Yeah, that does make infinite Luchries, right? And eventually you just target something.
Well, you have to they're legendaries. You have to sacrifice one of them. It creates infinite death triggers.
It does create infinite ETB. I guess if you spree though, it lets you draw 2, discard 1 until you choose not to.
No, because you have to copy it as put on the stack, so you will deck yourself.
Well, yeah. Well, but
all nodes.
You just need another creature eventually, or some other thing to target to break the loop. But you could.
Yeah, you just need an artifact in play or something.
Yeah, I mean, 9 mana. Who cares? Super easy.
Yeah, jokes aside, I do think that the versatility on a counter spell like this. I mean, I was already every time there's a cancel where I'm like, this is just the best cancel I've seen. I think there is a lot of opportunity for the cancels to be better, and they use that, but without making them cheaper, which is what you don't necessarily want. You just can't have counterspell running around. But even the catalog mode, I like what you were saying about just having decks that might want the other modes and be in the market for a counterspell that is the other modes, because they might just not be planning to use it as a counterspell because it's not a counterspell deck. They're not a deck that needs cancels, but they're a deck that might play a catalog. Stern Scolding was a card that was played for a bit in Pioneer, creativity, and being able to put that kind of thing into your deck while also then getting access to a couple of more counter spells for the times it's relevant is really cool. And also, I ain't gonna be mad at it if you counter my spell and draw 2 and then discard a card. I've done my own share of Cryptic Commanding as Dismiss. I mean, it's a good thing to make it like, because the inherent weaknesses of cancel of being so much mana make it bad. Making cancels that feel good for the cancel player at more mana than that, without having to make them all terrible, is I'm a pretty big fan of, fundamentally.
Yeah, big agree there. Just they aren't very strong, and so you might as well make them stronger, right? Even if they aren't everyone's favorite thing to do. People went crazy for Dissipate. Was that the one? Or Dissolve? That was the Scry one back when I was first starting to play. I remember that. They were like, whoa, I get to Scry. Now look at them.
Yeah, who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought? Speaking of who'd have thought, I would be surprised if anyone read the set and thought this card wouldn't be on our list. If not, maybe we thought maybe Spencer would be here and get left off. But I think this card is, for my money, the biggest winner, at least of OTJ cards. There might be some big cards that are better, but Aan Interruptor is a really strong card in my opinion. So this is 1 white for a bird rogue creature, 2/2 flash and flying. When Aan Interruptor enters the battlefield, exile target spell, it becomes plotted. Spells your opponent casts from graveyards or from exile cost 2 more to cast. So, on its face, Abe, you go to cast your Shield Druid, bam, Aan Interruptor, plot it, and then when you go to cast it now, it's going to cost 2 more. So, I think if we didn't even have the bottom line attacks of spells your opponent casts from graveyards or exile cost 2 more, this card would already be like, for sure, it's like a sleeper on my list if people weren't talking about it, Just like, obviously insane tempo play, very strong, not legendary. I can have multiple of these. Just a very, very powerful sort of spell queller, elite spellbinder, fiend hunter combination card, in the vein that we've seen White been doing. But the fact that it does those things while also adding on this taxing effect for when they play it again means that, it really does affect them in a pretty real way and can throw their turns off. Like, we've seen in the past that cards like Reprieve and Remand are very playable. And those cards, draw you a card and cost a little bit less mana. This puts a 2/2 in play and throws off other things. Maybe Abe had some other card plotted, and now it's going to cost 2 more. Maybe you put a creature on an adventure, it's going to cost 2 more. Maybe you want to flashback your Memory Deluge. That's going to cost 2 more, which might be a negative, but, probably it's not going to be a negative. Probably 9 mana is going to be a serious amount of mana. And then just interacts randomly with so many things. And that's the part of this card that really tells me it's pushed, because if it was just even spells from exile 2 more costs, I would be talking about how great that is against Cascade, That card, that deck obviously just got nerfed, but this is just randomly good against that, right? This is randomly good against things like Unleash the Beast from these adventure version of Druid of the Cow, or Druid of the something, I forget its name now. But basically all the red effects where you exile a card and can play it till the next turn, this card is good against those. So this card just randomly hits so many cards. The thing it hits gets put in that zone, and also you can only play a card as a sorcery from being plotted. Even they will get if they kill this, they get to play it again later at sorcery speed for free, in air quotes. That is still pretty big, because it might not work that way for them in a very advantageous way, right? Let's say that, Abe goes for his hammer, and then I, put it in there and plot it, right? Well, now Abe can't cast it again, right, unless he's doing it at sorcery speed, and that's going to change things. If you hit a counter spell with this card, then, let's say Abe casts Negate on my spell, and I, flash in an Aan Interruptor. Well, Negate is just gone. If you cast Negate at sorcery speed, that's, not a legal play. And there are plenty of weird things like that come up with this card. I've talked enough. I think this is one of the best cards. It is one of the few cards I pre-ordered. I'm a big believer. Abe, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is another card that was on my short list of this is going to be a hit for a lot of the reasons you were talking about. I think that, Elite Spellbinder was really good because of the fact that it would make it so that things that needed to happen couldn't happen over the life of a game, because the game would close before the opponent got to the point where they could spend the extra 2 mana on their effect they needed. I think this has even more application than that in terms of denying your opponent the interaction they need to have, because, like you said, as much as it might be easy for them to pay 2 mana the next turn to do the thing they need to do, they've already up front invested the time of, okay, I'm going to cast this spell on the turn they did that you are plotting it. So let's say they go to Sunfall you out of domain, and now you're casting Aan Interruptor, they don't get to choose to do something else with their 5 mana, which is like when you Spellbinder someone, like, okay, I'll Spellbinder your Sunfall. Now, maybe you play some other spell, like you play an Angel of Wrath that stabilizes the board instead, and then you Sunfall 2 turns later. You don't get that opportunity. You don't get that mana back. Like, you already invested it. You'll get it back in the sense that you'll get it when you get to plot the card next turn and cast it for that additional 2 mana when this is in play. But you don't get to do anything with that mana to impact the board this turn. And that's huge. Like, that's what takes this from being a, like, worse Thoughtseize effect to a worse than counterspell effect, right? Like, worse than Remand sometimes, or like Reprieve sometimes, where, I mean, honestly, in some ways better than Reprieve at times too, right? If your opponent is casting a removal spell at instant speed, and now you've plotted it, they don't get to cast that removal spell again until their next turn, their next main phase. And all of that are just play patterns that make this card way, like, instead of reading in a way where it's like, okay, I could see where this would be good, but there's probably some downside I'm not thinking of. A lot of those downsides where it plays worse than it looks, I think, have deeper hidden upsides that make it play better than those downsides look like they'd be. And I think it's just going to be a really, really solid card. Yeah, huge fan.
Abe, what's your first hit?
My first hit is Pest Control. And this is from the not Aftermath set, which is white-black sorcery, destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less, and it has cycling 2. I don't think I need to do too much to explain why this card, I think, is going to be a hit. I think that, decks like Convoke in many formats, I mean, even apparently, pure no supplemental sets modern, Convoke is like very good and plays on the fact that there's a lot of ways to get a lot of material in terms of tokens and bodies for 1 mana or less. And it's hard to clean those things up for a reasonable rate currently. I mean, Temporary Lockdown does a great job, but costs 3 mana and is white, so it's pretty restrictive to a lot of decks that maybe only play a little bit of white. It's also, undoable by disenchant removal. Hidetsuku's Consumes All is a black-red multicolor card that also costs 3 mana and is not necessarily the best. And when it's not good, you kind of get stuck with it. And this solves so much of that in having cycling, while also so much of it can be kind of expensive to do on the draw into something like even like a Thalia by just being an incredibly efficient effect. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add here, but I do think this is like a very special kind of sideboard card or even main deckable card that pretty easily hates out one of the more powerful things going on in multiple formats right now, Pioneer and Standard.
No, I think you nailed it. Even like older formats too, there are just going to be times where people are putting in a lot of 1 mana value or less things, and cleaning that up is big. This like answers Chalice of the Void, answers Chrome Mox, answers, a Mother of Runes. Just this card is very good. I think it is very, very good. And it also having cycling just means like if somehow you've brought this card in or it's in your main deck, but like especially if you sideboard this and for some reason, it's not lining up well because they've successfully pivoted against you, well, you can just cycle it away. And that is very strong. And I believe when I was talking about other cards in the set that maybe are better than Aan Interruptor, this is like one of the ones that jumps out to me. I was like, okay, maybe this is better, but, it's going to be tough. And even then we're comparing, 2 of the best cards in the set, in my opinion. So I think it's an all-time banger.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about like the applications of it for, vintage or legacy, Forcible formats, and Moxen heavy formats, but most definitely it has a ton of utility there. My other hit is another clean and simple design of Scorching Shot, which is red sorcery, deal 5 damage to target creature. I know that something that when I was playing mono red for a hot minute in standard would happen to me a lot is, and one of the things that made like the positioning of mono red for me really good in the tournaments I was playing it in was the existence of Obliterating Bolt as a way to push through like Preacher of the Schism that also could like save my Witchstalker Frenzies for Shieldreds. Scorching Shot is another way to have removal spells that you can just cast and then do other things to get through some of the huge creatures that get in your way in some of these smaller aggressive decks. And I think even outside of an application of like standard, red, deal 5 to a creature, like Roast is a card that would show up every now and again in formats where you didn't have like Unholy Heat, or you weren't a deck that was enabling Unholy Heat. Like in Pioneer, one of the best ways to answer Shieldred was, Roast. If you're playing against, Vein Ripper right now in Pioneer, red, deal 5 to Vein Ripper is a way you can answer that card without, 2-for-1ing yourself or without spending a ton of mana, and that didn't exist previously. So I think that this one is one of the better, red removal spells we have now. It's a pretty big upgrade to Roast, which was not really like, at the time it was pretty revolutionary to be such a big removal spell at that cost, but hasn't been top of the heap in quite a while. But with all the X5s that are present in formats right now and kind of red lacking answers to them, I think this fills a void that was much needed for a clean, efficient, and simple answer to very, very present problems in the format.
Yeah, I think this is just a good kill spell, like you said. And honestly, I look at Pioneer 2, and it's just like, I keep talking about wanting to make like Pioneer mono red like a thing. It's just so wild to me that an archetype that is so prevalent in so many other formats, with varying power and success, but is there, just doesn't show up in a real way, and Shieldred is one of the huge reasons for that. Obviously, she's at a lower point right now in the format, but I think Scorching Shot just is so good, and, I like this card a lot, and imagine, I'm going to be playing it a lot, and I'm glad I got, my play set or whatever. So this is a good card.
Yeah, I can't imagine being like, like, I don't have to ask the question anymore of how am I going to beat this specific, like, problem I'm having in terms of, like, my opponent's playing a threat I need to get past. Like, well, I'm going to use this to kill it. There's not many X6s that roll around in the formats where I'm thinking about playing this card. And yeah, so hopefully I like playing a good red deck. I'm hoping it keeps those on the mat.
Abe, I like this set. I think it was a cool set. I think it's a lot stronger than people give it credit for, and maybe I'm just way off base, but it strikes me as going to be a set that people are going to be like pleasantly surprised with how powerful the cards are. Yeah.
As far as the, I guess, new era, I'm not going to say new era of Magic, but the current back-to-back era of Magic we're in, of like black and white movies sets, like this one, and also like Murders, I think are gameplay-wise look really cool. I'm excited to, play with it. I'm excited to see how it impacts Standard. I'm excited to see how it impacts Pioneer. And to see where it goes. And I don't know, I think a lot of the kind of fun of it, of being cowboy hats and saloons and shootouts, has kind of maybe shrouded some people from the fact that there's a lot of really strong cards in the set.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes people get lost in things that aren't what actually matter. We talked about with Jide earlier, right? It's like, yes, it's that thing, but it's not that thing. So like, remove yourself from that. Remove yourself from it's got like, oh, it's got silly names, oh, there are cactus people. But yeah, I'm really excited. And honestly, Abe, like personally, I'm really excited because I'm basically caught up now. This was like the last standard set I knew anything of from my work on MH3. And it's been weird doing these previews where knowing a lot of the cards, kind of feeling like I had a good feel on everything, and preview season 2 just kind of hitting a little different than it was before, because there were things I didn't know that I saw, here, and that was cool. I got to think about those cards a bit more, but I don't know, I kind of had like a dopamine rush back in January of last year. I saw all these new cards that they thought would matter and be important for me to see. And now I get, we're going into Bloomborough. I just have one more set. I get to watch y'all talk about MH3, which is more exciting for me. I get to engage with that in a much more fun way. And I'm just excited to get back into the rhythm of things very soon here of just, experiencing it all in real time and, getting to think about it. It's just really cool. I've missed it.
No more reruns.
Say what?
No more reruns, baby.
No more reruns, that's right. And no more, is that what that did? I thought it's something different, did they change? What happened? What's going on here? So, anyways, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the show. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us at CCMTG everywhere that you listen. You can go and support our sponsors, Heavy Play and Untapped GG. Both of those things are in the description for this podcast episode. Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
You can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. DMs are open for coaching, as well as you can email me at morenothings@gmail.com.
If you want to find me, you can find me over on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. I'm probably going to be doing more stuff there. I got into the MTGO Content Creator Program, so that's going to be some cool things coming very soon that I'm excited to talk about. You can also find me at SCG Atlanta this weekend. If you're listening to this episode live, I will be there Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I know that Friday, right before the episode started, Corey messaged me and wanted me in this little backpack area. So if you're looking for a CCMTG wristband, for sure on Friday I'll be over where Corey is in the corner with the lights and stuff. So look for that, and feel free to come up and say hi. And if you're interested in coaching, I have a couple spots left right now. I am kind of scaling back on things for lots of reasons, but all that matters is I have a couple spots left. So if you are interested in coaching, it is better to reach out now than later, even if maybe you don't pull the trigger right this instant. To do that, you can reach out to me on my Twitter at Mason E. Clark, or you can reach out to me via email, masoneclark@gmail.com. Put coaching in the description. That way I know that you're not a spam bot. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode, and we'll see you next week for another episode of CCMTG.